When I made my last video yesterday, I discussed briefly the report that has been done by Special Counsel Yar into the case that has been brought against the President in terms of his retention of classified documents, and Special Counsel Yar's view that there was a case, an arguable case against the President, but that he had decided that it was inappropriate to bring the case because he doubted that a jury, or was unsure that a jury, would convict given the President's age and age-related issues. Well, when I made yesterday's video, I had not seen the subsequent press conference which the President gave, in which he attempted, so far as I can see, to rebut the allegations that Special Counsel Yar was making. I say allegations, though I would be wary about using an expression like allegations to describe what are the conclusions that are set out in that kind of legal document. Anyway, I'm going to say briefly that I think the press conference was a train wreck. It was even worse than some of the media reports had led me to believe. And I'm afraid that in normal circumstances, it would be such as would result in drastic action being taken by the President's supporters to spare him the rigours of an election campaign. For the record, I don't expect that action to be taken. What I am going to say, however, about that report about that press conference is this. I think it will have reinforced doubts in the Middle East about the purposefulness of American policy, and will expose US foreign diplomats, notably Secretary Blinken, to, well, if not questions, at least to doubts on the parts of his interlocutors about whether he really is speaking for the President and therefore for the United States in the various discussions he's having. But secondly, given the obvious problems that the President is having, the fragility which he conveyed, it looks to me as if his opponents in Congress are now going to be circling and preparing to take further action to capitalize on his apparent weakness. And I would have thought that makes it even less likely that the House of Representatives will, in the end, pass the appropriations bill for Ukraine that Senator Schumer has now presented to the Senate. And of course, without that funding bill, Ukraine's position is going to move from its current position, which is merely catastrophic, to one which, in terms of its ability to conduct the war, I would have said was, well, worse than catastrophic, impossible. And there's been an article which I've read, I'm not going to discuss it further, in Bloomberg, which makes the point that the funding provided by the European Union, the funding that Viktor Orban agreed to, the 55 billion euros of funding over 4 years, is going to change nothing if the United States does not step in and authorize this appropriation, because without this appropriation, Ukraine will be left still with a massive funding gap, around $28 billion by some calculations, in terms of the funds it needs this year. And without that funding, it's very difficult to see how an inflation crisis is not going to start to take hold in Ukraine. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this actually rather painful episode. I have to say that I found the press conference difficult to watch. Everybody who has been following my programs and the programs we make on the Duran will know that I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, a supporter of the president, not in any conceivable way. But I have to say, I found it difficult to watch a press conference like that, and I'm astonished that people around him have not drawn the obvious conclusions in his own best interests from the struggles he appears to be having. Anyway, I'm going to move on from that, and I'm now going to return to the situation in Ukraine. I do intend to say a little more about the situation in the Middle East. First, I'm going to focus, however, on Ukraine, because it seems to me that the crisis there is coming to an increasingly dramatic point. Now, it is very difficult to get a detailed picture of what exactly is happening in Avdeyevka. I noticed that the military summary channel postponed their evening video yesterday. It came out today, and it began with a long complaint from Dima that all kinds of contradictory information was being provided by all kinds of different sources, and that there was a dearth of information from geolocations, and that he felt that it was not possible to take a rigorous approach, the kind of rigorous approach which he commendably takes to trying to understand the actual situation on the ground. I'm going to go actually even further than he does. The military summary channel, very properly and correctly waits for video evidence before they update their maps. But as I've discussed in the past, video evidence itself can be misleading. We see, for example, the drone attack on a particular military unit, and that is sometimes taken to mean that the place where this attack happens must be under the control of that military unit, or at least of the army to which that military unit belongs. But of course, we are dealing with a very dynamic battlefield situation. Things change all the time. We don't always know exactly when these videos are made. And of course, it's always important to remember that the two sides who publish these videos are battling in the information space, and the videos themselves might be misleading. There is a particular case in point of a video which I saw yesterday, which I noticed, by the way, that the military summary channel was publishing, which purported to show some fresh Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield in Avdeyevka, looking spotlessly clean and apparently ready to launch a counterattack in some direction. And various people were making assumptions about the fact that this was these soldiers looked fit and well prepared, and, as I said, clean and ready for action. To my mind, given the pristine condition of these soldiers, that looks to me straightforwardly like a propaganda picture, and I'm sure that it bears no relation at all to the actual situation on the battlefronts. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that I think it is extremely difficult to get a precise picture of who controls what in Avdeyevka at this particular point in time. To give an example, there is now an accumulation of reports, which, by the way, I tend to believe that the Russians have captured this famous motor depot, which that they are supposed to be aiming to capture. There's also other reports, which I take a little less seriously, that the Russians have captured entire territory around a feature referred to as the Blue Lake. I presume it is a real lake. There are other reports which say that the Russians are pushing towards a particular cafe to the west of these particular positions. I'm not sure I take that report particularly seriously. And there are further reports which place the Russians on a road in Avdeyevka, somewhere to the south of the motor depot. The Ukrainian channel that has published this has given what looks to me like a frankly improbable picture of Russian dispositions. Anyway, trying to assemble all of this together, very difficult for someone like me. It's clear that there's a great deal of confusion as to what exactly is going on. And of course, that is exactly what one would expect at a time when a very complex and violent storming operation is underway, which is clearly what is going on in Avdeyevka at the moment. But I don't think one actually needs to get into the detail of this, to go into the weeds in the way that some people do. At least, I don't think it's necessary for most of us to do. Obviously, for those who want to chart and explain the nature of the battle, for those who want to give a picture, an idea of how quickly this battle will end and how many thousands of Ukrainian troops risk being surrounded, for example, in Avdeyevka, it is important. But for the rest of us, what really matters is the signs of ongoing collapse. And that, it seems to me, is the only way to describe what is happening in Avdeyevka at the moment. The Russians have established a wedge in the center of Avdeyevka. That wedge is broadening. The Russians are taking more and more territory under their control all the time. Ukrainian losses appear to be horrendous. No doubt Russian losses in this kind of fighting are high as well. The Russians, however, have massive advantages. Their drones are operating constantly and all the time. They have a huge preponderance of artillery. And of course, their air force is active as well. And I saw a report which says that on the previous night, not last night, but the night before, the Russians dropped around 100 Fab 500 bombs on Ukrainian positions in Avdeyevka, which seems an astonishing number of bombs to drop on what is, after all, a relatively limited territory. It's also clear that all of the main roads into Avdeyevka, even if they have not actually been physically cut by the Russian army, by which I mean that they haven't actually occupied positions on these roads, and it does look as if they have occupied positions on at least some of them. But it's clear to me that all of these roads can now be hit by Russian artillery, and not just Russian artillery, but shorter range Russian equipment like mortars, anti-tank missiles, that sort of thing. And whilst it's probably true that the Ukrainians can still send some men and even some supplies down at least some of these roads, I suspect that that is becoming more difficult by the hour. And the collapse And this has, by the way, been true of the entire battle of Avdeyevka, is taking place faster than I would have considered possible, than I did consider possible when the operation to capture Avdeyevka began in October. I've seen various people say that the Battle of Avdeyevka is taking a long time, given how heavily fortified this place is. For me, it is taking a much shorter time than I would have expected. The opposite, by the way, of what happened in the Battle of Bakhmut. Bakhmut, I thought last year, would fall faster than it did. Many people often like to remind me of that fact. In Avdeyevka, it has been the other way around. Anyway, an ongoing collapse in Avdeyevka. Lots of talk about Ukrainian counterattacks to try to reverse the situation. The military summary channel was again floating the idea of a Ukrainian counterattack towards the village of Krasnogorovka to the north of Avdeyevka, which the Russians captured as long ago as March last year. I would have thought that given the ongoing collapse that we're seeing, the prospects of that kind of offensive or counterattack succeeding must be close to zero. And I don't know how many Russian troops are currently operating inside Avdeyevka itself, but I think it is inconceivable that the Russians do not have large reserves in the area. And with Donetsk city nearby, the main Russian hub of operations in the entirety of Donbass, I would have thought that it would be relatively straightforward for the Russians to send more troops and more supplies and more equipment to counter any Ukrainian counterattacks towards Krasnogorovka. And of course, they have total control of the air. They're able to bomb Ukrainian positions at will. And I would have thought that any Ukrainian armored forces that tried to push towards Krasnogorovka would face, well, probably annihilation, not to understate things. So, a disastrous situation in Avdeyevka altogether. Now, yesterday in my program, I said that it's clear to me that a cauldron is now being established, and I noticed that the military summary channel in its title today used that very word, and I think we are now justified in talking about a cauldron in the sense that Ukrainian troops in southern and central Avdeyevka, and it's important to remember that the Russians control a large stretch now of southern Avdeyevka. They captured it about 2 weeks ago in a sudden operation, the one that resulted in them capturing the Tsar's hunting lodge and all of that. Anyway, those Russian troops have apparently been consolidating and regrouping. They've apparently been reinforcing. This film showing Russian troops reinforcing in precisely this area. They have not yet attempted an attack on their own. So the southern pincer that the Russians have in this area has been on standby. You could say that it's the it's the anvil with the northern pincer, the one that's broken through in the northern central part of Avdeyevka, acting as the hammer, and that the Ukrainians are caught between the northern hammer of the Russians and the anvil in the south. But of course, it could be that these troops will be activated as well. And of course, at that point, with the Ukrainian troops in central and southern Avdeyevka now increasingly running short of supplies and being shelled and bombed continuously and relentlessly by the Russians. A further collapse there is not impossible. And with supplies, as I said, along these roads, which are now raked with Russian fire, probably very difficult, I think it's appropriate to refer to the situation now as a cauldron. Having said that, the word cauldron, as has become clear to me over the last 2 years, has different meanings in particular military situations. The situation which arose in Mariupol in 2022 was a cauldron, but of course it was more than a cauldron. It was an outright siege. The Ukrainian troops were completely encircled. There was no way for them to retreat. They were put in a situation where, hiding as they were under the Azovstal steelworks, they had no option other than to fight to the death or to surrender, which is, of course, in the end what they did. That is one kind of cauldron. But there are other cauldrons, other situations where it seems to me the word cauldron is appropriate. This is where troops are encircled, caught in effect, as I said, between a hammer and an anvil in terms of where the enemy forces, the Russian forces in this case, are located. A place where it has become impossible for them to be supplied to the level that is needed. And it is important to remember that men in battle need enormous numbers of supplies. They need ammunition, they need shells, they need food, they need water. No doubt there are large supply depots within Avdeyevka itself that the Ukrainians are able to draw upon. But it is a reasonable guess that the Russians by now, who have clearly researched the ground in Avdeyevka very carefully before starting this whole operation there, that's presumably how they came to work out the existence of that famous pipe that helped them to send a special forces unit behind the Tsar's lodge, Tsar's hunting lodge location. Anyway, the Russians probably have a fairly shrewd idea of where many of these depots and supply positions are situated. And this rain of bombs, which has been falling on Avdeyevka, some of those bombs, as well as smashing up Ukrainian fortifications, have probably been used to destroy several of these supply depots and warehouses and other things, reducing the supplies available to the Ukrainian soldiers and putting those soldiers in a critical situation. So the Ukrainians, in order to continue resisting in Avdeyevka, will need supplies, and supplies are probably not coming in the quantity needed along these shot-out roads. And of course, I mentioned food and ammunition. It's important to mention medical supplies as well. The medical supplies that soldiers in battle need, many of them become wounded. They're critically short, probably by now, of the medications and medical equipment that wounded soldiers need if they're to survive as well. So, a very critical situation. And I think all of that, it is justifiable to refer to it as a cauldron. It is, however, I suspect, still possible for the Ukrainian troops in this area to withdraw with a reasonable prospect that at least a significant number of them, if they withdraw now, will be able to escape. Now, this is what happened in 2015 during the Battle of Debaltseve in the Donbass. A Ukrainian force was encircled by the Russians, people, or at least by the Russian separatists, as they were referred to at that time. The Russian army was not formally involved in the fighting at that time. But anyway, a Ukrainian force was encircled. This caused panic in the West. It led Angela Merkel to make a quick dash to Moscow, where she met in private with President Putin. That in turn, those discussions that they had in private with each other, Merkel and Putin, led to a further meeting in Minsk, out of which the 2015 Minsk agreement emerged. But anyway, the Ukrainian troops were encircled in Debaltseve. Reports at the time spoke of them being in a cauldron. If you read accounts of that battle today, they still refer to the Ukrainian troops being in a cauldron. But eventually, a decision very belatedly was made that those troops should withdraw, and they did. And whilst some of them were left behind and were captured, a significant number of them were able to escape, though without their heavy equipment and after suffering significant losses. And it seems to me that this is the situation in which the Ukrainians are in now. They need to make that decision as soon as possible to withdraw along these supply roads and along the fields to the west of Avdeyevka. It's winter, so the ground is presumably frozen and hard, so it should be possible for men to move across the fields. It would be an operation that would have to be carried out at night, because during the day, obviously, the Russians would be able to track it with their drones and their aircraft. Even at night, of course, as I've discussed in previous videos, there are Russian drones now with thermal images which are able to observe the battlefronts at night, but nonetheless, the darkness would still provide some cover. So the option of retreat, of escape from the cauldron that is now essentially developed still exists. But of course, the longer that is delayed, the greater the Ukrainian losses will be. And the risk is that the Russians will eventually actually take physical control of the roads. Some of these reports that I spoke about earlier, the contradictory ones, the ones that claim that the Russians are on the brink of capturing a cafe well to the west of Avdeyevka, and all of that, they might suggest, if they're true, that the Russians are actually very close now to cutting these roads, physically actually taking control of these roads. If the Ukrainians delay too far, the cutting of the roads might happen. The Russians might be able to bring more forces into the fields west of Avdeyevka. And then we will move from the kind of cauldron we have now to a tighter type of cauldron, one which can perhaps be better described as a siege, one that might start to look more like what happened in Mariupol in the early summer of 2022. So, time is short. I am not going to try to guess the total number of Ukrainian troops in the central and southern parts of Avdeyevka. And I'm not going to try to guess how long those troops can hold out if a decision is made to keep them there. But it seems to me that the longer Ukraine, General Syrskyi and President Zelensky delay making the decision, the more critical the situation of those troops becomes. And despite this gradual move Ukraine is making towards some kind of mobilization, which could prove deeply controversial within Ukrainian society, despite all of that, the state of the Ukrainian army at the present time is such that I don't think Ukraine is in a position to simply lose these soldiers. And that puts aside all humanitarian concerns, which ought to be paramount anyway. So, a critical situation for the Ukrainians in Avdeyevka. Now, I have to say, at the moment, there's little actual sign of this counterattack being organized. There was an awful lot of talk a few weeks ago about great Ukrainian fortified lines being built west of Avdeyevka. I've said that I had seen little sign of this, not just in west of Avdeyevka, but along the northern borders, in western position, west of other places in Donbass, in anticipation of the likely capture of many places that are now being contested, Avdeyevka, Chasov Yar, all of these places. Anyway, little sign apparently of these fortifications being built. Lots of talk about counterattacks, but I've seen no real sign of these counterattacks being organized. It seems to me that at this present moment in time, the overriding priority of President Zelensky, at least, and perhaps of General Syrskyi, his new overall commander, is not so much to take action on the battlefronts as to complete this very complex reorganization of the military that they initiated when General Zelensky, the previous overall commander, was sacked. And we're having more and more reports. The chief of staff has now been sacked. There's a new ground forces commander to take the place of General Syrskyi. He, by the way, is General Pavlyuk. I seem to remember that General Pavlyuk was quite a prominent figure in the early weeks of the special military operation. And I may be wrong here, but I also seem to recall that President Zelensky at one point sacked him, but it seems that he's been brought back, if I'm right about that. But anyway, there is this major reshuffle taking place. Reshuffles, reorganizations are all very well, but when carried out in the middle of an operational crisis, like the one that Ukraine is facing at the moment, reorganizations of this kind are disruptive. The people who understand the situation or who are familiar with the situation are being removed from their posts. The people who are taking over will, at the very least, need time to familiarize themselves with what is happening, and they will also need to familiarize themselves with their subordinates, and that inevitably takes time. And given how dynamic the situation currently is in Avdeyevka, I wonder actually whether this is the right moment to carry out a reshuffle of that sort. But of course, for Zelensky, for President Zelensky, perhaps for General Syrskyi, it is a priority. Getting rid of General Zelensky's people seems to be more important, or perhaps the most important thing to do at the present time. And in the meantime, well, the situation on the battlefronts presumably can take care of itself. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about Avdeyevka because this is by far the biggest battle. I will say that the whole situation along the battlefronts is deteriorating for Ukraine. Now, when I did my program last week, I mentioned the fact that the Russian Defense Ministry, the week before, in its assessment, said that over the course of the week before, Ukraine had suffered losses of 5,000 men, dead and wounded, over the course of that particular week. Now, late on Friday, the Russian Defense Ministry provided its weekly update of the situation in the week which had just passed, and it was striking that the total number of losses that the Russian Defense Ministry attributed to Ukraine, and I want to stress these are always losses that the Russians are giving, they're not Ukrainian figures, but these are Russian figures. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry increased the total of Ukrainian losses over the course of last week from the 5,000 that we'd had the week before to over 6,000, actually from memory, 6,250 over the course of the week that has just passed. So a significant uptick. But as I have also pointed out, the Russian Defense Ministry is not providing us with updates about the place where the fighting has been most intense, which is Avdeyevka. They're no longer providing us with updates. They haven't, in fact, provided us with updates about the progress of the fighting in Avdeyevka or of what they calculate Ukrainian losses to be in the Avdeyevka area. And given the intensity of the fighting in Avdeyevka, we can only guess that these losses have been very high. Now, that was true in the week when the Russians said that Ukrainian losses amounted, dead and wounded, amounted to 5,000. And it was also true for last week when the Russian Defense Ministry said that Ukrainian losses were around 6,250. So it's a reasonable guess that every day last week, Ukrainian losses, dead and wounded, must have been at least 1,000 men a day, possibly higher still. And as several people have noticed, just as the Russian Defense Ministry is not providing us with updates about the situation in Avdeyevka, they've ceased providing us with updates about the situation in and around the village of Rabotino in Zaporozhye region. This is despite the fact that there's this cascade of reports from Russian reporters of significant Russian advances in the area of Rabotino as well. That suggests to me that a major operation connected to Rabotino and the entire Bradley Square area, the area between Rabotino and Verbovoye, the area south of Orechov, is now about to be launched. But putting that aside, it means that we don't have up-to-date information from the Russian Defense Ministry about what they think Ukrainian losses in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. We don't have up-to-date information for that either. So, as I said, it is likely that Ukraine is now losing along the entire battlefronts, men at a rate of 1,000 a day, dead and severely wounded. And of course, this is an unsustainable level of loss, especially with the forces that Ukraine has at the present time. And putting aside the fact that we might fairly soon see a big Russian advance in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, we are getting information about further Russian advances in other places. The Russians seem to be making a concerted push in Novomikhailovka, this village to the south of Marinka. There were reports that the part of the village which is still under Ukrainian control, has also been bombed. 17 Fab 500 bombs, supposedly, dropped on Ukrainian positions in Novomikhailovka over the course of a single night. I think that was not last night, but the night before. This is, again, a massive rain of bombs. And presumably the Russians are striking at specific targets. And just to repeat again, a point made to me way back in 2022 by a member of the Duran community, somebody from India, by the way, and one of the most helpful people who writes to me about about the conflict. He made the point that any single bomb, one with a weight 500 kilos or more, is going to cause much more devastating damage than any single artillery shell. And that if you want to break fortifications, bombing them from the air with heavy bombs is the most effective way. And that appears to be what we're actually seeing in Novomikhailovka, just as we saw it previously in Avdeyevka. And I, for one, cannot believe that Ukrainian positions in Novomikhailovka can be held for very long. And the indications are that indeed the Russians, who now apparently control around a third of this village, are busy working to capture the rest of it. And there's been more reports that they're doing the same around Bakhmut, that they're making significant progress now in the Bakhmut area, that the operational pause that we saw for about 2 weeks, perhaps intended to provide time to soften Ukrainian positions in places like Bogdanovka and Ivanivska, Krasnoye as the Russians refer to it, and in the fields and in between. All of these places have been subjected to very heavy shelling and bombing by the Russian Air Force. Well, anyway, that process appears to have been completed. The Russians, by all accounts, have made further advances. They appear, according to some reports at least, to have captured a cemetery area to the west of Bakhmut. They've captured, again, according to various claims, the Popovka forest. They're fighting within Ivanivska itself, which some reports claim is being attacked from 2 directions. And they continue to maintain their attacks on the Ukrainian positions in central Bogdanovka, though they haven't yet, so far as I can see, launched a ground operation to capture the whole of that village. Anyway, it does seem as if the Russians are making progress, and that Ukrainian losses, again in the Bakhmut area, are appallingly high, and the fact that there is a deterioration in Ukrainian positions in this area is perhaps indicated by reports that the Ukrainians are now busy evacuating the remaining civilians from Chasov Yar and also civilian administrators from this town, which supposedly is now going to become a purely fortified position. The Ukrainians have rushed troops to Chasov Yar. They appear determined to make a fight of this place. Now, by the way, I've heard conflicting accounts about Chasov Yar. The consensus that I'm reading now and hearing now is that this is a very difficult and very strong position, very difficult to capture, that the Russians will have to fight very hard to capture Chasov Yar. Perhaps that's true. It is a relatively small place, however, and I can remember during the fighting in Bakhmut, a Ukrainian soldier telling a Western journalist, this is last year, that in his opinion, Chasov Yar was all but undefendable, that the buildings were too fragile, that there was not therefore enough cover, and that the place ultimately was too small. It would not be able to resist the Russians in the way that Bakhmut had been able to do. Well, that was then, and perhaps since then the Ukrainians will have built more fortifications in this area. We will see. But again, bear in mind that last year the Russian Air Force was still relatively inactive. They were launching airstrikes in and around Bakhmut, as I remember, and the Wagner organization has some aircraft of its own, which are also launching airstrikes. But nothing comparable to the level of bombing that we are seeing now, which, to repeat again, is comparable to anything that the United States is wont to do in its various military campaigns. The Russian Air Force is now extremely active indeed across all parts of the front lines. And anyway, a deteriorating situation in Bakhmut. It's been more news, again difficult to get full details of, about the Russians making further advances towards Tierny and Yapolovska, another village on the Oskol River in the Liman area. Again, not always easy to get full information about this. And the Russians, again, most reports seem to confirm that now they're making finally real progress in capturing Sinkovka. According to some reports, they now control around 40% of this village, and they're continuing to intensify their attacks upon it. So the Ukrainians under intense pressure all along the front lines. They're being bombed, they're being shelled, they're being hit by drones. The Russians are able to deploy large numbers of armored vehicles now, increasingly large numbers of armored vehicles in their operations. And it's probably still true what Putin said way back in the summer of 2022, when he said that the Russians hadn't really got started yet. Well, I mean, clearly they're doing an awful lot now. They're hitting the Ukrainians currently very hard. But it's still the case, and it's important to stress this, that the bulk of the Russian army in the area has yet to be committed fully to the battle. Now, there are also other intriguing bits of information coming through that the Russians are now increasingly successful in jamming Ukraine's Starlink terminal, and perhaps in order to rub salt into Ukrainian wounds, we're having lots of reports about the Russians having bought Starlink terminals in the United Arab Emirates and distributed them amongst their own military, and about them using Starlink themselves to coordinate their operations. I doubt that this is actually taking place on any significant scale, by the way, but clearly the Russians are doing it as a way of, as I said, demoralizing the Ukrainians even further. That seems to me more likely what that is all about. So anyway, a major operations by the Russians. I repeat what I said yesterday. It's a duel now, a fight now, between a lightweight boxer who's already been badly knocked about and a heavyweight boxer who is only now starting to get into his stride. And before long, the knockout punch is sure to come. Now, the big event that I suppose we're all waiting for is what happens when in Avdeyevka, assuming that Avdeyevka is captured fairly soon. Probably the Russians will stop for a few weeks during the period of the spring Rasputitsa. But then, of course, they have various options about what to do. And here I'm going to say again that Mikhail Valterson in one of his recent tweets, provided a very useful map. As I've said many times, I'm not good at looking at maps, but he provided a very useful map, which made it apparent to me how all of these places, Avdeyevka, Bakhmut, Marinka, Liman, Kupiansk, how they all link up together. We're talking about, basically, as far as I can tell, one continuous belt of fortified positions along a very long area in Donbass. Fortified positions that the Ukrainians clearly built up over the 7 years before the special military operation began. I remember way back in 2022, there were references to this belt of fortifications. It was being referred to as the Zelensky line. Well, it's clear that the Zelensky line is now fully coming apart. And from what I can see, once it is properly breached, there's not really many places behind it where the Ukrainians can create anything analogous. And it's not to say that the fighting in Donbass would be quickly over. The Russians would still have to take 3 very significantly big places: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Pokrovsk. And of course, they would need to wrap up the battle at Vuhledar, which you could argue is the southern terminus of the Zelensky line. So it would be a difficult and complex battle still. But it seems to me that the most difficult part of the battle would have ended, and the defensive places like Pokrovsk and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, it seems to me, despite the size of these towns, would be relatively difficult, given that the Ukrainians would at that point lack operational depth. Or so it seems to me. But then, of course, I'm not an expert in these matters. And what do I know? Anyway, there we go. A complex, difficult battle playing out in Avdeyevka. We will see what the Russians choose to do. But it seems to me that we must be looking now at the final days or weeks of this battle there, which has developed much faster than I anticipated. Now, for an explanation of why this battle of Avdeyevka is playing out faster than I had anticipated. Why there is this operational crisis right across the battlefronts. I would again go back to an absolutely outstanding video, well, two videos actually, that Brian Beletic has just done on the new Atlas. In every discussion of the logistics of this war, the resources each side has at its disposal in this war, he has been, it seems to me, consistently ahead of the curve. So in his penultimate video, he did a piece about these small diameter bombs, rocket-launched bombs that we're now hearing that the United States is finally supplying in some quantity to Ukraine. He explained why these rocket bombs would not be a game changer, not by any means. He made a point about these rocket-launched bombs, which I found especially interesting, actually, which is that he pointed out that he'd actually begun discussion of them in November 2022, that the idea of creating these things had been floated, apparently by Boeing, around that time. And this was suggested as a cheap and simple way of creating a piece of equipment that Ukraine would be able to use on the battlefronts. That was November 2022. And according to reports in the American media, these rocket bombs are only now being supplied to Ukraine in visible quantities. It is likely that a few of them have been used in the past, probably as test batches, but it's now only now finally that they're starting to appear on the battlefronts. So it has taken the United States more than a year to get this, what we were told, relatively simple piece of equipment based on rather cheap components. It's taken the better part of more than a year to get it into operation for Ukraine. Now, contrast that with what's going on the other side. The Russians, for example, over the course of that same year, have developed kits for their aerial bombs, which have transformed them into precision-guided munitions. That, of course, also is a relatively cheap and inexpensive thing to do. But the Russians are doing this in huge quantities, and they're causing massive devastation to the Ukrainian forces. The Russians have also massively increased artillery production, and they have begun producing drones in quantities of tens of thousands. And they've been able to do that over the same period of time that the United States has used in order to develop and start production of these small diameter rocket launched aerial bombs. Now, again, I'm not an engineer. No doubt there were engineering challenges to overcome, but it does seem to me a very long time, a year and more than a year and a quarter, to place into production and service in appreciable quantities what was originally sold as a simple and easy to produce weapon. And I saw that the French defense minister came forward and proudly said that France has been able to greatly simplify and reduce the amount of time that it takes to produce a particular weapon, and he gave the example of the Caesar howitzer, and apparently it now takes only 15 months to build a Caesar howitzer, self-propelled howitzer, as opposed to the 30 months that it took to produce one previously. More than a year. Now, I have to say, again, given that we're in a wartime situation, at least as far as Ukraine is concerned, that doesn't seem that impressive to me. Now, in his very last program, Brian Beletic has talked about shell production in the United States, and he has provided a link to a fascinating program in which Undersecretary Bush of the United States finally provides us with information about the state of shell production in the United States. And the first thing to say, the immediate takeaway that I took, is that the lowest estimates of shell production in the United States have turned out to be the correct ones. Now, in order to understand the true and full situation about shell production and its many problems in the United States, I strongly advise you to go to Beletic's program on the new Atlas. I'm not going to repeat the details here, but Undersecretary Bush said that production of shells, 155 millimeter shells, had doubled since the time when the Russians launched the special military operation. And there was a graph provided, which you could see, even I could just about make it out. And it seems to me that production was indeed around 14,000 shells a month before the Russian special military operation began. And it has doubled, and it is, well, shall we say, between 28 and 30,000 rounds a month. And he talked about a plan to increase production to 80,000 155 millimeter shells a month. But he outlined the immense difficulties of this, and it was far from clear to me that these difficulties are anywhere close to being overcome. At the moment, production has peaked at around 28 to 30,000 rounds a month of 155 millimeter artillery shells in the United States. In addition, as Brian Beletic also pointed out, in terms of missile production, which is entirely carried out within the private sector, the United States has one factory that makes these shells, but at least it is state-owned. Missile production is carried out by the private sector. There is no capacity, no ability to surge production there at all. So, what is all this discussion about the $61 billion that we're hearing about in the United States? What is all this talk that we're hearing about the need to continue to supply Ukraine with shells because they're going to run out of shells? The United States isn't producing anywhere near enough shells that Ukraine needs to conduct this war. The Ukrainians themselves have said that they need around 6,000 shells a day in order to be able to hold their positions, just to hold their positions. And the United States isn't producing anywhere close to that figure. Nor, of course, are the Europeans. Now, we haven't been given complete figures for the totality of shells that are being produced in Europe. The French defense minister said that France has increased its shell production from 1,000 rounds a month to 3,000 rounds a month, which is less than half of what Ukraine says it needs on any particular day. The United States and Ukraine, as I said yesterday, burnt through their stocks of shells, 155mm shells, in 2022, and calamitously in 2023. I said they burnt through their stocks of shells, even the 500,000 shells they took from North Korea. They burnt through them all in that catastrophic offensive of the summer. And whatever Congress authorizes, and I think it is increasingly unlikely that it is going to authorize anything, to be frank, but whatever Congress authorizes, as Brian Beletic has previously said, it is not going to produce shells. You cannot buy shells in the necessary quantities if those shells are not there and are not being produced at the levels that you need. And General Zelensky, just before he was sacked, published a long analytical piece, the kind that he likes to engage in which he spoke about the fact that Ukraine needs to move again to a great new technological level. Simplikis, the thinker, has a discussion about all of this. He seems to think that the way forward is for Ukraine to transition wholly to drone warfare, produce huge numbers of drones, attack the Russian forces with drones, swamp them with drones, prevent them advancing through attacks with drones. It is a fantastic, it is a ludicrous idea. Because, of course, however many drones Ukraine is producing, the Russians are producing many, many more, and probably their production of drones is only just cranking up and will increase by further volumes over the course of this year. We're told, by the way, that they will start to introduce heavy drones into the battlefield, drones like the S-70 Охотник, which is a jet-powered drone, very powerful stealth drone. That will start to appear, apparently, in the second half of this year. Anyway, the Russians will be comprehensively able to outmatch the Ukrainians in drones. And as I and many people have already said, you cannot win a war with drones alone. You need men, you need artillery, you need shells, you need tanks, you need aircraft with bombs. You need all of those things. And Ukraine is desperately short of all of them. So, this is an utterly catastrophic situation. There is no turning round. It's likely, as I said, that Avdeyevka will fall. It may fall, may take a few weeks before it happens. I'm not going to give a precise time. It might, if the Ukrainians make the correct decision and pull out, happen more quickly. It's likely that Kupiansk, at least, will be under attack at some point over the next couple of weeks. It's also plausible that the Russians will reach the Oskol River line and perhaps the Chasov Yar canal at some point over the next few weeks as well. They seem to be working towards preparing some big thing in the Rabotino area. Well, we shall see. But altogether, this is a terrible situation, and it is delusional to think that it can be turned round, and the only logical way out is through peace talks. Now, I've analysed and discussed at length in various programs now, Tucker Carlson's interview with President Putin. But just to reiterate again, though President Putin's doubts and suspicions of the Ukrainians and of the West are now enormous, as they must inevitably be, and though he is already setting out very harsh terms for the way in which the conflict might end, nonetheless, he has gone out of his way to say that he remains open to negotiations. Surely, in everyone's interests, those negotiations should begin right away. And when I say everyone's interests, obviously, principally and primarily, I mean Ukraine, but I also mean the United States, which ought to be concerned about the geopolitical effect on it and the effect on its international standing of a disaster in Ukraine, and it also means the situation, the position of the European states as well. There was a terrible article in Bloomberg which spoke about how Germany's position as an industrial superpower is now coming to an end. How the cut-off of cheap Russian energy has basically broken it. Something, by the way, which on the Duran we were saying the very day, as I remember, that Olaf Scholz suspended the operation of the Nord Stream pipeline. And the extent of the crisis in Germany is again illustrated by the increasingly gloomy statements that Chancellor Scholz is now making about Germany's prospects. And what I found is his incredibly shrill comments about Russia that he made over the course of his meeting with President Biden in the United States. One senses that Scholz sees that the writing is now on the wall, but again, he's not able to draw the logical consequences and begin that process of negotiations, which in Germany's interests, the German government needs to do. No doubt he realizes that were he to take such a step, his government would fall and he would cease to be chancellor. But one would have thought that a political leader in his position would understand that the stakes now are too great, that the risks for Germany, the country he leads, are too high, that the risks for Europe, the continent in which Germany is so dominant, are now becoming so great that at the very least he needs to come straight to his people and explain that the war in Ukraine is being lost and that negotiations with the Russians have become imperative. Well, he's not able to do that. Nobody, it seems, in the West is able to do that. We must carry on with a war that is being lost, with a diplomatic, geopolitical, and economic debacle which is being played out. The Ukrainians must drink this cup of poison, it seems, to the bitter dregs. And, well, it's not so bad for us in the West. At least we're not directly involved in the war, but it's pretty bad all the same. Anyway, I'm now going to come briefly to the situation in the Middle East. We now have this operation that Israel seems intent on launching towards Rafah. Saudi Arabia and Egypt have come out very strongly in opposition to it. No less a person than Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, a person who has never hesitated up to now to hold back in her strong support for Israel. She too is now coming out and saying that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is wrong, and she's starting to ask, what is the future? What future does Israel really imagine the people in Gaza to have? Of course, what Baerbock is saying is only a mild version of what people in the Middle East are saying. The bombing goes on. The United States continues to bomb and launch missile strikes. The Houthis continue their activities. The situation on Israel's northern border remains incredibly tense. And I've been seeing reports that the UN Secretariat is saying that the situation is one where Israel is showing complete non-compliance with the orders of the International Court of Justice. 2 weeks have passed. It's taken no step to implement those orders. It's treating the decisions of the International Court of Justice with complete contempt. It is almost setting itself up, in other words, for a situation where there will be a referral to the General Assembly with all the mandatory orders that the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, is likely to make. And the President of the United States looks distracted. He is focused, it seems, on an election where his likely opponent, Donald Trump, is looking increasingly strong. It looks as if the Supreme Court is about to come down strongly on Trump's side on the disqualification issue. And of course, the recent press conference highlighted the president's own fragilities and the fact, as I said, that the various diplomatic representatives that the United States sends to the region are unlikely to be speaking with his full authority. We have a debacle playing out in Ukraine. It looks to me as if we're now seeing an equally terrible debacle play out in the Middle East as well. Well, there we are. I'm going to finish my program. At this point, we'll see what happens. Focus, no doubt, will remain on Avdeyevka, though no doubt some kind of operation against Rafah will be launched before long. And in the meantime, let me say again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can buy the amazing things you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.